Raekwon's Purple Tape turned 30 years old today, and I gotta say, I found it a little intimidating to talk about one of the greatest albums of all time. And as you can see, I'm holding up my original cassette copy of the Purple Tape. It's a very weathered copy. So instead of doing a long, drawn out, track by track breakdown of this project, I wanted to switch it up a bit and just focus on one main aspect to this classic, and that is just how cinematic it was. Of course, the Purple Tape is the blueprint for many of your favorite hip-hop artists. Even on a more mainstream level, artists like Clips repeatedly have mentioned that they use the Purple Tape as a source of inspiration to this day when they record a new project. And we already know the influence an album like this had on many in the underground scene. So I always looked at this project as more than just a dope classic album with exceptional rapping and exceptional production. There was more to it than that. It was a cinematic masterpiece and one of, if not the most cinematic album of all time. Of course, there are other hip hop albums that instantly stand out as movie-like. We could easily list them. And it's possible that some of those albums may resonate with you more. But for me, nothing can quite compare, or nothing can quite capture to what the RZA and the whole Wu did 30 years ago on the Purple Tape. And here's why. So if I would start with the first reason why I feel it's the most cinematic, you'd have to start with just the storytelling alone. And you could also talk about RZA's vision. If we start with the storytelling alone, Ray and Ghost immediately brought you into their world. This played out like an intelligent gangster movie, from the opener, striving for perfection, to the bonus closer, North Star. Something I want to stress here, the stories from Ray and Ghost weren't too overblown. They weren't too far-fetched or overly luxurious as if they were some kingpins who already had made it. In fact, it was kind of the opposite on Cuban Linx. Ray and Ghost here were more in survival mode, talking about their dreams of wanting more out of life than just to be sitting around with 200,000 worth of drug loot. Now, of course, that's not to say there weren't moments of lavishness on this project, because there certainly were. And Ray and Ghost, they weren't broke. They were fly in 95, and they had their iced down medallions and all those kinds of things. But there was still that element of hunger to this project. There was still that urgency, and I think that's very relatable and authentic for most people. This was also a reflection of where Wu-Tang was at this point in 1995, because then they were stars, but they hadn't become megastars like they would go on to become in, let's say, 97. So I feel this project is a soundtrack for those early to mid-level hustlers who are getting it straight out that ground level with some rubber banded money. It's a come-up criminology tale. And then, of course, you had the RZA's vision as the backdrop, and he added another layer of cinema with his mind-blowing production. So the instrumentals by themselves were some of RZA's best, and it was almost as if he had produced a score without realizing then. We know later on RZA would actually go on to technically produce scores, but in 95 he directed this movie like a score in the most raw and uncut way. You had so many different sounds and styles here, whether it was some of the plush mafioso sounds, or the gritty soul samples, or the blaxploitation references, the 5% rhetoric, and of course throw in some of those kung fu elements. There were just all these sounds and styles and chambers that made this album so different and made it so brilliant. Of course, one might be tempted to argue that that's something in common with a lot of Wu projects, and while I could agree to an extent, there was still something a little more special about the way things were done on the Purple Tape. And I'd have to say, the second reason this project is so cinematic is the skits, and the skits' connections to actual movies themselves. Of course, this is not the first album with good skits in hip hop, right? We know this, but the way the Wu used skits from mob movies here, I think just set a new kind of standard for how to do so in a way that seamlessly ties it all into the music. Also, the skits from Ray and Ghost where they were talking, they also function as scenes themselves. And then, of course, you have snippets or actual dialogue from these movies. And for me, that always ended up enhancing my appreciation for those movies. Like, you could tell it wasn't that they just decided to throw in a random Scarface movie sample or a random sample from the Mac. No, it was intentional, and there was a purpose on why they did it. And when I would find myself watching those gangster and mob movies years later, I would still somehow find a way to relate it back to Cuban Linx. And that's just more evidence on how cinematic this thing was. It was as if, in my eyes, I viewed Cuban Linx as the hip hop equivalent to those films. So it ultimately became the audio version of The Godfather, or a Scorsese flick. And the last layer for why this was so cinematic is a little more personal for me. I'm not sure if anyone else felt this way when listening to this project. Some of you probably have. But listening to the Purple Tape as a younger person, the 14-year-old version of me, it did make me feel like I was almost a part of what they were talking about, or like I could have been a character in it myself. I would listen to the album and in a way kind of zone out and imagine or maybe project scenes and sounds from this album onto my own surroundings in real time. Let me break it down a little more. So I grew up in the Pittsburgh area, and Youngstown, Ohio is close. And of course, if you know just a little bit about Youngstown, Ohio, it always had a lot of mafia lore. At one point back in the day, it was called Crime Town, USA. And even Pittsburgh had its own chapter in the mafia. The Pittsburgh Mafia is somewhat slept on in general, but after reading about them, they had a lot more reach than you may think. So I say all that to say this. After listening to this album in '95, it seemed to conjure up images in my young mind of the mafia mystique in these locations. And that just seemed to add another layer of cinema for me. And that's just the power of this album. I would credit the Purple Tape with jump starting my interest in reading about organized crime in general. Of course, Kool G Rap is the main architect of this style. Let's not get it twisted. And there were other great mafioso releases around this time that had a huge influence on me, like G-Rap's 456, AZ's Do or Die, Nas's It Was Written, Jay's Reasonable Doubt, Mobb Deep's The Infamous, Capone Noriega's The War Report, and you could even go down south with an album like The Diary. But when we were talking about mafioso masterpieces only built for Cuban Linx, still has no equal. 30 years later, the Purple Tape is still timeless and still inspiring many. So let me know your thoughts below. How impactful was this album on your life? But it's your boy Mixtape Mob. I'm signing out as always. Peace and blessings.